The apartment had what real estate agents charitably call character. To be clear, that meant the floors slanted towards the west. The water pipes groaned like a dying whale, and one of the kitchen cabinets refused to close, staying permanently agape as if in silent shock. But it also had pre-war charm, a decent amount of sunlight, and most importantly, a rent that was almost laughably below market rate. For a recent law school graduate drowning in 6 figures of student loan debt and facing the monolithic terror of the upcoming bar exam, it wasn't just an apartment. It was a goddamn lifeboat. My life had shrunk to the 4 corners of that slightly crooked living room. My days were a monotonous cycle of flashcards, practice exams, and the low-level hum of anxiety that accompanies knowing your entire future rests on a single 3-day test. The world outside my window, the vibrant, bustling city, might as well have been on another planet. My world was civil procedure, torts, and the lingering scent of stale coffee. The landlord, Mr. Sterling, was a man whose physical form seemed to be a perfect metaphor for his properties. He was old, stooped, with a perpetually sour expression, as if he'd just bitten into a lemon. Our interactions were mercifully brief. I'd slip the rent check under his office door on the first of the month, and he'd grunt at me if we passed in the hallway. He was a creature of routine and quiet resentment, a resentment I soon learned was directed at the absurdly low number on my rent check. Rent control, he muttered to me once, his eyes scanning my apartment door as if he could see the money he was losing evaporating through the wood. Criminal is what it is. A man can't even make a decent living off his own property. I just nodded and scurried away. I didn't want to engage. I didn't have the time, the energy, or the desire to debate economic policy with a man who still used a flip phone. My only goal was to remain invisible, pay my rent on time, test Hébert, and get a job that would allow me to move into an apartment where the floors were level. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday. I turned on the shower only to be met with a pathetic dribble of ice-cold water. I called his office. No answer. I left a message. I texted his ancient phone number. The next day, a notice was slipped under my door, written in his spidery, aggressive handwriting. Emergency plumbing repairs, it declared. Expect water shut-off for the foreseeable future. Foreseeable future turned out to be a full week of cold showers and boiling kettles of water just to wash my face. I lost precious study time trekking to a friend's apartment across town just to feel human again. My anxiety spiked. The bar exam was in 5 weeks. This was a distraction I couldn't afford. When the hot water finally returned, it was with a shudder and a bang from the pipes that sounded more ominous than ever. I was just so relieved I didn't question it. I should have. A week later, the real assault began. Mr. Sterling knocked on my door at 9 p.m., startling me so badly I sent a stack of evidence flashcards flying across the room. He claimed he needed to inspect the smoke detectors. As he stood in the middle of my living room, he wasn't looking at the ceiling. He was looking at my stacks of books, my laptop, the frantic mess of a student pushed to her absolute limit. You make a lot of noise up here, he said, his eyes narrowed. A lot of activity, at all hours. I'm studying for the bar exam, Mr. Sterling, I said through gritted teeth. It's a lot of work. Sounds like a lot of parties to me, he grunted, before poking a smoke detector with a broom handle and leaving as abruptly as he arrived. The final blow came the following Monday. Taped to my door was a formal-looking document. My heart plummeted. It was an eviction notice. It was typed, but it was riddled with errors a first-year law student would have spotted. It cited lease violations as the cause. The violations listed were excessive noise at unreasonable hours, creating a disruptive environment, and my personal favorite, unauthorized long-term guest. I lived alone. My long-term guest was my perpetually worried mother who had come to stay for 2 nights the month before to make sure I was eating. The excessive noise was me pacing my small living room while reciting the elements of a contract. The notice stated I had 30 days to vacate the premises. My blood ran cold. 30 days. The bar exam was in 28 days. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. He wasn't just trying to evict me. He was trying to sabotage my entire future. He wanted me out panicked and desperate, so he could slap on a coat of cheap paint, fix the cabinet, and rent this place for 3 times what I was paying. He was counting on me being just another scared kid who didn't know any better. And for about an hour, he was right.
Panic seized me in its icy grip.
My carefully constructed study schedule crumbled into dust. How could I find a new apartment, pack, move, and study for the most important exam of my life all at the same time? I couldn't. It was impossible. I sat on my slanted floor surrounded by the architecture of my dream career and felt the walls closing in. I cried. I cried with the frustration and the fear and the sheer injustice of it all. Then, my eyes landed on my property law textbook, a massive, dog-eared tome sitting on top of a stack of bar prep materials. The cover depicted a blindfolded Lady Justice holding her scales. And something inside me shifted. The panic began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning fire. I had spent 3 years of my life and accrued a mountain of debt, learning the very rules this man was now trying to break. He thought I was just some girl. He had no idea I had a weapon, and I knew how to use it. I picked up the eviction notice again, but this time I wasn't reading it as a terrified tenant. I was reading it as a lawyer in training. And it was beautiful. It was a symphony of legal malpractice, wrong notice period, vague and unsubstantiated claims, failure to follow proper service procedures. It was a document written by a greedy amateur who assumed the law was a suggestion, not a mandate. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, razor-sharp focus. My bar prep had been about hypotheticals. This was real. Mr. Sterling had just given me the ultimate practice exam, and I was going to ace it. I didn't study for the bar that night. I studied Mr. Sterling. I transformed my tiny apartment into a war room. I pulled every text message, every email, every scrap of paper he had ever given me. I created a timeline of the harassment, the week-long hot water shut-off purr, the unscheduled late-night inspection, the passive-aggressive comments. I photographed the leaky faucet under the sink that I had reported twice in writing and he had ignored. I documented the crumbling plaster in the bathroom. I looked up the local tenant-landlord ordinances, my fingers flying across the keyboard. It was a treasure trove. He hadn't just broken 1 or 2 rules. He had systematically violated nearly every key statute protecting tenants in my city. My city's laws were clear. A landlord couldn't evict a tenant from a rent-controlled unit without a very good reason, and it had to be proven in court. A retaliatory eviction trying to kick a tenant out for requesting repairs or for simply existing was highly illegal and came with severe financial penalties. The week without hot water wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a breach of the warranty of habitability, a fundamental legal principle. For each day the apartment was uninhabitable, he was liable for damages. His flimsy eviction notice wasn't just void. It was an act of illegal harassment. But I wasn't just angry anymore. I was exhilarated. The law wasn't some dry academic subject anymore. It was a shield. It was a sword. And I was about to go to battle. I spent the next day not writing practice essays, but drafting the single most important document of my life. It wasn't a letter from a tenant. It was a legal notice from a soon-to-be legal professional. I structured it like a formal complaint you would file in court. I began with a calm professional salutation. Then, point by point, I eviscerated him. Notice of lease violations and demand to cease harassment. I started with the eviction notice itself. To be advised, I wrote that the document titled Eviction Notice, taped to my door on July 2nd, is legally deficient and void ab initio for the following reasons. I listed them all, citing the specific statutes and city codes he had violated. Failure to provide adequate notice period per Civil Code Section 1946.1. Vague and factually unsupported claims failing to meet the just cause requirements. Under City Ordinance 37.9a. This constitutes an illegal attempt at a constructive eviction. Then I moved on to the apartment itself. Breach of the warranty of habitability. I detailed the plumbing issues, the ignored repair requests, the week without hot water. Pursuant to state law, landlords are required to maintain their properties in a condition fit for human occupation. Your failure to do so entitles the tenant to remedies, including rent withholding and damages. Finally, I tied it all together under the heading, retaliatory action and harassment. It is clear, I wrote, my fingers dancing on the keys, that these actions have been taken in retaliation for my status as a rent-controlled tenant. The pattern of behavior from the sudden and prolonged repairs to the late-night inspections and baseless eviction notice, constitutes a campaign of harassment designed to force me to relinquish my tenancy. The final section was the masterpiece. Demand for remedy and settlement offer. I laid out what he was facing if I took this to court. The city's ordinance allowed for tenants to sue for wrongful eviction for up to 3 times the actual damages, plus punitive damages. There were penalties for the habitability breaches. There were penalties for harassment. I ballparked a conservative number. It was well over $20,000, not including attorney's fees, to avoid costly and time-consuming litigation for which you are unlikely to prevail. I wrote / the sentence tasting like sweet victory / I am prepared to offer a settlement. My terms were simple. 1. Immediate repair of all outstanding issues in the apartment, including the plumbing and the plaster, to be completed by a licensed contractor within 7 business days. 2. A legally binding agreement that all future communication would be in writing only and all inspections would require a minimum of 48 hours written notice. And 3. In compensation for the illegal eviction attempt the breach of habitability, harassment, and the significant emotional distress caused during the critical period of my bar exam preparation, I will be granted a full rent abatement for a period of 12 months, effective immediately. I printed the letter on high-quality resume paper. I signed it, my signature for the first time feeling like it had real weight. I made a copy for my records, placed the original in a crisp business envelope, walked downstairs, and slipped it under Mr. Sterling's office door. It was the exact same way I delivered my rent check. But this was different. This was a bill. The silence for the next 2 days was deafening. I tried to study, but my focus was shot, my mind replaying every word of the letter. Had I gone too far? Was he going to double down, hire a lawyer, and make my life hell? The waiting was its own form of torture. The call came on Thursday afternoon. His name flashed on my phone. My heart hammered against my ribs. I took a deep breath / channeling the calmest, most detached lawyer persona I could muster, and answered.
Clara, he said. His voice was completely different.
The gravelly, aggressive grunt was gone. In its place was a smooth, almost oily tone. He sounded like a different person, Mr. Sterling here. I received your letter, and I think there has been a terrible misunderstanding. I don't think there's been any misunderstanding at all, Mr. Sterling. It replied, my voice as cool and steady as a frozen lake. I believe my letter was perfectly clear. Now, let's not be hasty, he said quickly. You're a smart girl, I can see that. A little high-strung, maybe, with all that studying. Haha. That eviction notice was just a formality, a mistake from my office. We can just tear that right up. It's not a mistake, I said. It's a legal document, one which forms the basis of a claim for wrongful eviction. A claim I am fully prepared to pursue. He was silent for a moment. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. What do you want? He finally asked, the fake pleasantries gone, his voice tight with frustration. I want the terms I laid out in my letter, I said. It's a settlement offer. You can accept it, or I can file my complaint with the housing authority and the small claims court on Monday morning. The choice is yours. A year's free rent? He squawked, his voice reverting to its usual unpleasantness. That's insane. It's extortion. No, Mr. Sterling, aside, a small smile playing on my lips. It's the law. I suggest you consult it. Or better yet, consult an attorney. Show them my letter. See what they advise. You have until 5 p.m. tomorrow to provide me with a written acceptance of the settlement terms. And then I hung up. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. But at 4:52 p.m. on Friday, a crisp white envelope was slipped under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a settlement agreement typed up by a lawyer agreeing to every single one of my terms. All he had added was a confidentiality clause, which I found immensely satisfying. He didn't just want this to go away. He wanted it buried. I signed my copy slid his signed copy back under his door and felt a wave of relief so profound it almost brought me to my knees. The following Monday, a team of professional plumbers arrived and fixed everything. The water pressure was amazing. The faucet didn't leak. A contractor came and repaired the plaster. The apartment was suddenly nice, and Mr. Sterling became a ghost. I never saw him again. If there were notices, they appeared under my door silently, always with proper notice. I spent the final weeks leading up to the bar exam in my quiet, peaceful, fully functional, and most importantly, free apartment. The thousands of dollars I would have spent on rent over the next year went directly toward my student loans. The cloud of financial panic that had followed me for years began to dissipate. But it was more than the money. That whole ordeal was the best preparation for the bar exam I could have ever asked for. It crystallized everything for me. The law wasn't an abstract set of rules in a book. It was a real tangible thing that could protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful accountable. It was a tool. When I walked into the exam hall, I wasn't a scared student anymore. I was a warrior who had already been to battle and won. I didn't just have a law degree. I had the unshakable confidence that came from using it. Mr. Sterling tried to illegally evict me, and in doing so, he inadvertently paid for my rent and my legal education. And that, I thought as I opened my exam booklet, was what you call justice. The year of free rent was a strange and transformative period. It was like living in a bubble of suspended reality. With the crushing weight of rent lifted, a significant portion of my ever-present anxiety simply evaporated. The money I saved went directly into the gaping maw of my student loan debt, and for the first time, it felt like I was making a dent, not just treading water. The silence from Mr. Sterling was absolute. He had become a phantom landlord, the building's ghost, and I was perfectly happy with the arrangement. Passing the bar exam was the key that unlocked the next chapter. The day the results were posted online, I stared at my name on the pass list for a full 10 minutes convinced my screen was displaying some kind of cruel mirage. When the reality finally sunk in, the joy was so potent, it felt like it was lighting me up from the inside out. I was no longer Clara, the terrified law student. I was Clara Thorne, Esquire. The title felt like a suit of armor I had forged myself. With my newly minted license to practice law, I started job hunting. I sent out dozens of applications to firms all over the city. During interviews, when asked about a time, I faced a significant challenge. I didn't talk about moot court competitions. I told a carefully anonymized version of my story with Mr. Sterling. I framed it as a dispute resolution and a complex negotiation. One interviewer, a senior partner at a small but aggressive tenants' rights firm leaned forward, a predatory gleam in her eye. "You did what?" she asked. I told her the whole story. She hired me on the spot. The firm was called Justice for Tenants, a name so earnest it bordered on cheesy, but the work was fiercely real. My boss, a woman named Sarah who had the energy of a hummingbird and the tenacity of a pit bull, threw me right into the fire. Suddenly, my battle with Mr. Sterling seemed like a small-scale skirmish. I was dealing with slumlords who operated entire networks of dilapidated buildings/families, facing no-fault evictions, and tenants dealing with harassment far worse than what I had experienced. My little apartment, the lifeboat, became my sanctuary. For the first time, I had money to spend on it. I bought a new couch, one that didn't smell faintly of desperation and fear. I painted the walls a warm, calming blue. I even found a clever way to brace the perpetually open kitchen cabinet so it would finally close. I was investing in the space, making it a home, not just a place to hide. Living there for free felt less like a lucky break and more like a fellowship I had awarded myself. It was the spoils of my first war. The year passed in. A blur of court filings, client meetings, and late nights drafting motions. I was good at it. I was more than good. I was relentless. Because I knew what it felt like to be on the other side of that table. I knew the sick feeling of panic that came with an eviction notice / the helpless rage of being ignored. When I spoke to a landlord's attorney, I wasn't just arguing legal theory. I was speaking from a place of deep, personal conviction. As my 1-year settlement agreement neared its end, I prepared to start paying rent again. It was fine. I had a good job. I was on my feet / and I was grateful for the breathing room the year had provided. A week before the first of the month, an envelope was slipped under my door. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was a standard lease renewal form from Mr. Sterling's office. But there was a sticky note attached, written in his spidery scrawl. It said, "Same terms as last year." I stared at the note. It was a question mark hanging in the air. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a trick. It felt / tentative. Was he offering me another year of free rent? The idea was ludicrous. Was he so terrified of me that he'd rather lose another $12,000 than risk another confrontation? Or was it something else? A strange, twisted form of respect? My first instinct, the lawyer instinct, was to get it in writing, to draft another ironclad agreement. But the human part of me, the part that had been buried under years of stress and ambition, was just a musette. I thought about the power dynamic. He was the landlord, the property owner. But I was the one with all the leverage. He knew it. I knew it. I took the sticky note, drew a large smiley face on it, and wrote, "Sounds good to me." I walked downstairs and slipped it under his office door. No copies, no legal letterhead. Just a silent understanding between two former adversaries. I lived in that apartment for 2 more years. I never paid another dime in rent. The arrangement was never spoken of again. It was a quiet truce. The apartment with the slanted floors and noisy pipes had become the luckiest place in the city. It was my fortress, my reward, my secret. The day I finally moved out, it was on my own terms. I had saved enough for a down payment on a small condo of my own, a place with level floors and brand new plumbing. As I packed the last box, I stood in the empty living room and looked around. The sunlight streamed in, illuminating the fresh blue paint on the walls. This room was the crucible where my entire life had been reshaped. It was here I had cried in despair, here I had found my fire, and here I had become a lawyer. On my way out for the last time, I wrote a check. It was for 1 month's rent at the original rate. I put it in an envelope and added a simple note. "Thank you for the extension, Mr. Sterling. It's been a pleasure." I slipped it under his door / a final symbolic gesture. It wasn't an admission of debt. It was a declaration of peace. I didn't owe him anything / and he didn't owe me anything more. We were even. As I walked out of the building and into the bright, bustling city, I didn't look back. My landlord tried to illegally evict me, and in the process he gave me a free home, a career, and the unshakable belief that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to know the law better than the person trying to break it. He had wanted character. He just didn't realize I was the one who was going to build it. The condo was everything the old apartment wasn't. The walls were plumb, the floors were level, and the water pressure was a consistent, gentle force. It was quiet, stable, and entirely mine. Yet, sometimes, in the dead of night, I'd wake up with the phantom feeling of a slanted floor beneath my feet, a physical memory of the battle that had defined my early adulthood. The fight with Mr. Sterling had become my origin story, the bedrock of the lawyer I had become. At Justice for Tenants, I had earned a reputation. I was the one who read the fine print, the one who found the loopholes in the landlord's favor and turned them into nooses. I was relentless, meticulous, and I rarely lost. 3 years after moving into my condo, a case landed on my desk that felt like an echo from the past, amplified 100 times. It wasn't a single tenant. It was an entire building. The Westgate Arms was a beautiful, slightly faded brick building from the 1940s, one of the last rent-controlled strongholds in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. Its 50 units were home to a cross-section of the city's disappearing middle class, retired teachers, artists, young families, and elderly residents who had lived there for decades. They had formed a tenants association, and they were facing a corporate, 21st century version of Mr. Sterling. The building had been purchased 6 months prior by Apex Properties, a faceless real estate investment trust with a portfolio as vast as its reputation was predatory. Apex didn't use clumsy harassment or handwritten notices. They used the law itself as a weapon. They had invoked the ELIS Act, a controversial state law that allowed landlords to evict all tenants if they were taking the property off the rental market. It was a legal maneuver designed to clear out entire buildings of rent-controlled tenants so they could be converted into luxury condos and sold for millions. It was technically legal, but it felt like a profound injustice. I met with the Tenants Association in the cramped community room of the Westgate Arms. The air was thick with fear and defiance. They were led by an elderly woman named Elena Rodriguez, a retired nurse with sharp, intelligent eyes and hands gnarled by arthritis. She had lived in her apartment for 45 years. She showed me a picture of her late husband on their balcony in 1978. "This is my home, Miss Thorne," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "They say we have 120 days to leave. Where do people like us go?" Looking at Elena, I saw the ghost of my own potential future. Had I not had a law degree, had I not found the courage to fight back, I could have been her, panicked, facing displacement, my life appended by someone else's greed. This case was no longer just a professional obligation. It was personal. It was a debt I owed to the universe. Apex Properties was represented by a top-tier corporate law firm. Their lead attorney was a man named Julian Croft. He was everything I wasn't. Tall, polished, radiating the easy confidence of a man who had never had to worry about making rent. In our first meeting, he was condescending, referring to my clients as the occupants and treating the evictions as a simple, unfortunate business transaction. "Law is quite clear, Miss Thorne," he said, steepling his fingers. My client has decided to go out of the landlord business. It's their right. We will, of course, provide the legally mandated relocation assistance." The legally mandated assistance was a pittance. Barely enough to cover a security deposit and first month's rent on a new apartment, assuming they could even find one they could afford. It was a joke. The law also has provisions concerning bad faith, Mr. Croft, I countered, my voice even. If it can be demonstrated that your client's primary intent is not to go out of business, but to circumvent rent control laws to redevelop and sell the property, this entire ELIS Act eviction can be invalidated. He chuckled. A dry, dismissive sound. Proving intent is a notoriously high bar. I wish you the best of luck with that. It was a declaration of war. This wasn't about a leaky faucet or a grumpy landlord. This was about corporate shells, securities filings, and the very definition of intent. It was David versus Goliath, and Goliath had an army of lawyers. But I had something they didn't. I had the memory of a slanted floor. I turned the tenants of the Westgate Arms into an army of paralegals. Just as I had documented Sterling's every move, I had them document everything. We filed discovery motions that demanded every piece of paper related to Apex's purchase and plans for the building. Croft's firm responded by dumping tens of thousands of pages on us, a classic hide the needle in a haystack of needles tactic. My small office became a command center, with boxes of documents lining every wall. My team and I worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of righteous fury. While the legal battle raged, I focused on the human element. We organized press conferences on the steps of the Westgate Arms. Elena Rodriguez, with her quiet dignity, became the face of our fight. The story of a corporation trying to evict a building full of long-term residents, including a 90-year-old war veteran and a single mother working 2 jobs, began to attract media attention. We were losing in the courtroom, where Croft's firm outmaneuvered us with procedural delays, but we were winning in the court of public opinion. The pressure started to mount. The breakthrough came at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, when my eyes felt like they were full of sand. I was cross-referencing Apex's filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission with the timeline of their purchase of the Westgate. And there it was. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a tiny, almost invisible thread. A footnote in a quarterly report for their investors, filed 3 months before they officially purchased the Westgate. It mentioned a new capital initiative earmarked for urban residential conversion projects. It didn't name the Westgate, but the budget allocation and timeline matched perfectly. On its own, it was circumstantial. But then I dug deeper, cross-referencing it with emails we had acquired in Discovery. I found a chain between 2 Apex executives, discussing the Westgate acquisition and its potential for condo conversion profits a full month before that SIG filing. They had a clear, documented plan to redevelop the property long before they bought it. The decision to go out of the rental business wasn't a recent one. It was the entire predicate for the purchase. It was bad faith in writing. I scheduled an emergency settlement conference. In the conference room of Croft's lavish downtown office, I laid the documents on the table. I watched his face as he read the email chain, then the SIG filing. The mask of polished confidence cracked. He saw what I saw. A jury would not be sympathetic to a multi-million-dollar corporation that had plotted to kick a building full of people out of their homes. "What do you want, Thorne?" he asked, the condescension finally gone from his voice. "The Ellis Act eviction is withdrawn immediately," I stated. But we're past that. Your client has terrorized these residents for almost a year. That has a price." My settlement terms were audacious. Apex would offer every single tenant a lifetime lease, with rent increases capped at the legal limit for rent-controlled units. For any tenant who chose to move, Apex would pay a relocation fee 5 times the legally mandated amount, enough for them to find a new home without financial ruin. Furthermore, Apex would establish a $1 million fund for capital improvements to the building, to be overseen by the Tenants Association. Croft's jaw went slack. "That's preposterous, is it?" I leaned forward. "Imagine me reading this email to a jury, Mr. Croft. Imagine Mrs. Rodriguez on the stand. Imagine the headlines. My offer is not a negotiation. It's a lifeline I'm throwing your client before I sink their ship. You have 48 hours." They caved. The victory was monumental. It sent shockwaves through the city's real estate and legal communities. Justice for tenants had stared down Apex properties and won. At the press conference announcing the settlement, I stood behind the residents, letting them speak. Elena Rodriguez hugged me, her small frame surprisingly strong. "You reminded us that the law is supposed to be for people like us too," she whispered. That night, back in my perfect, quiet condo, I looked out at the city skyline. The fight with Mr. Sterling had taught me how to save myself. The battle for the Westgate Arms had taught me how to save a community. The law, for me, was no longer just a shield or a sword. It was a tool to level the playing field, to balance the scales. And as I looked at the twinkling lights of the 1,000 apartments across the city, I knew with a certainty that filled my entire being that there were a lot more scales that needed balancing. And I was just getting started. The victory at the Westgate Arms established my reputation, but it also painted a target on my back. In the world of housing law, I was no longer just an associate. I was a symbol. To tenants, I was a champion. To the big real estate interests, I was a menace. Julian Croft and his ilk didn't see me as a peer. They saw me as a radical, a bomb thrower who had gotten lucky. They were determined to prove that my win was a fluke and that, in the end, their money and influence would always prevail. I knew my biggest fight wasn't behind me. It was just beginning. The months following the Apex settlement were a grim testament to that fact. For every Westgate Arms we saved, 2 other buildings were being cleared out. The Ellis Act evictions were accelerating. Apex Properties, while legally bound to honor their agreement with my clients, simply shifted their focus, buying up other buildings and deploying the same strategy. My firm was overwhelmed. We were winning battles, but we were decisively losing the war. The law itself was the problem. It had been designed with a loophole big enough to drive a fleet of bulldozers through. The realization crystallized during a late-night strategy session with my boss, Sarah. We were staring at a map of the city dotted with red pins, each one representing a building facing an Ellis Act eviction. The map looked like it was bleeding. "Can't keep this up," I said, the exhaustion settling deep in my bones. "We're just running from fire to fire with a bucket of water." "We're not winning, Sarah. We're just managing the defeat." Sarah, ever the pragmatist, sighed. "It's the law, Clara. We can only fight within the system we have." "Then we need to change the system," I shot back, the idea taking root even as I said it. "What's the point of being brilliant lawyers if we're fighting with a broken sword?" That night, I didn't go home. I went back to my office and started drafting a different kind of document. It wasn't a complaint or a motion. It was a proposal. A proposal to amend the Ellis Act, to close the loopholes that allowed bad faith actors like Apex to weaponize it. I researched legislative history, studied similar laws in other states, and began to outline a bill that would protect tenants while still respecting the rights of small property owners who might genuinely need to leave the rental market. I was no longer thinking like a litigator. I was thinking like a lawmaker. The first step was building a coalition. I couldn't do this alone. I reached out to the heads of every major tenants' rights organization in the state, community organizers, and housing advocacy groups. I presented my proposal not as a final draft, but as a starting point. The response was overwhelming. They were all fighting the same losing war, and they were desperate for a new strategy. We formed the Coalition for Housing Stability, a united front with a single, clear goal: legislative reform. We had the people, but we needed a champion inside the state capitol. We found one in a young, fiercely intelligent assembly member named David Chun. He was from a working-class district and had made housing his signature issue. He had passion and a deep understanding of the human cost of the crisis, but he and his small staff were struggling to draft a bill that could withstand the inevitable legal challenges from the real estate lobby. When our coalition approached him with my detailed proposal, it was like a match hitting gasoline. This is it," he said, his eyes scanning the draft, a slow grin spreading across his face. "This isn't just a protest sign. It's a piece of airtight legislation. Miss Thorne, you've given us the weapon." Together, we refined the proposal into Assembly Bill 1128, which we nicknamed the Tenant Security Act. The moment it was introduced, the hornet's nest was kicked. The California Property Owners Association, the state's most powerful real estate lobby, declared war. Their public face was a smooth, silver-haired lobbyist who spoke in calming tones about property rights and the dangers of overregulation. Their legal muscle, to absolutely no one's surprise, was Julian Croft's firm. The fight moved from the courtroom to the Capitol hearing rooms. The contrast was jarring. Law was about precedent and facts. Politics was about influence, perception, and power. Julian Croft was exceptionally good at politics. He and I faced off in hearings, our arguments broadcast on the state's public affairs channel. He painted a picture of our coalition as a band of anti-capitalist zealots. He spoke of struggling mom-and-pop landlords who would be ruined by our bill, conveniently ignoring the fact that the vast majority of Ellis Act evictions were carried out by corporate giants like Apex. I countered with data and stories. I put my clients on the stand. Elena Rodriguez, her voice quiet but resolute, told the committee about her 45 years at the Westgate Arms. A young mother spoke about the terror of having to find a new home and a new school for her children, with only 120 days' notice. I was their lawyer, translating their pain into a compelling legal and moral argument for why the law had to change. The opposition, seeing they were losing the moral argument, resorted to dirty tricks. A conservative blog ran a hit piece on me. The headline was, "The Extortionist of Elm Street," a sensationalized and twisted account of my fight with Mr. Sterling. They painted me as a manipulative tenant who had blackmailed an elderly landlord into giving me years of free rent. They had somehow found him, and though the article used anonymous sources, his bitter, resentful quotes were unmistakable. They were trying to destroy my credibility, to frame me as a hypocrite who used the law for personal gain. The attack was a gut punch. It was one thing to fight a legal battle in the open. It was another to have my own history distorted and used as a weapon against the very people I was trying to protect. David Chun called me the morning the article was published. "They're scared, Clara," he said. "This is what they do when they're scared. Don't let them get in your head." He was right. I held a press conference that same day. I didn't hide. I didn't deny. I own my story. "Yes, I was once a terrified tenant facing an illegal eviction," I said, my voice steady as I looked into the cameras. "I used my legal education to defend myself. The opposition wants you to believe that this disqualifies me. I argue that it uniquely qualifies me. I am not fighting this fight based on abstract theory. I am fighting because I know personally what is at stake, and I will not be intimidated or silenced. My refusal to back down galvanized our coalition." The attack had backfired, making the opposition look like bullies. The vote on AB 1128 in the Assembly Housing Committee was scheduled. By our count, it was going to be painfully close. The swing vote was a moderate Democrat from a suburban district, a man named Assemblyman Miller, who was known to be friendly with real estate developers. The lobbyists from the Property Owners Association, led by Julian Croft, had been in his ear for weeks. The day before the vote, Miller announced he would be voting no on the bill, citing concerns about its impact on small business owners. It was a death sentence. His vote would kill the bill in committee. Our coalition was devastated. It felt like all our work had been for nothing. But as I read Miller's public statement, a familiar feeling pricked at the back of my mind. The language he used, the specific phrases about market health and unintended consequences, were almost identical to the language in a public statement released by Apex Properties a month earlier. It was too similar to be a coincidence. It was sloppy. It was arrogant. And it was a thread. That night I didn't sleep. I did what I did best. I dug. I wasn't looking for a bribe. That would be too obvious. I was looking for a connection, however faint. I searched through public records, campaign finance disclosures, and corporate filings of Apex's numerous shell corporations. And then I found it. Miller's wife was a partner in a small commercial design firm. 6 weeks ago, that firm had been awarded a massive, lucrative contract to design the lobbies and common areas for a new luxury condo development. The developer behind that project was a corporation called Pinnacle Group LLC. And after 3 hours of tracing a labyrinth of corporate ownership, I found that Pinnacle Group LLC was a wholly owned subsidiary of Apex Properties. There it was. It wasn't an illegal bribe in a briefcase. It was a perfectly legal, perfectly timed, life-changing contract for his wife's firm. It was influence laundered through a corporate structure. The next morning, an hour before the committee hearing, I requested a private meeting with Assemblyman Miller. David Chun came with me. In the sterile quiet of a Capitol meeting room, I laid a single piece of paper on the table. It was a simple flowchart I had drawn, showing the line connecting his wife's firm to Pinnacle Group and Pinnacle Group to Apex Properties. Miller looked at it. The color drained from his face. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, with panic and fury. "This is an outrage," he stammered. "My wife's business is her own." "I'm sure it is," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "And I'm sure it's a complete coincidence that her firm landed the biggest contract of its existence from the same parent company that is the single biggest opponent of the bill you are about to kill. But I wonder how a reporter The Sacramento Bee would frame that coincidence. I'm not here to make threats, Assemblyman. I'm just here to present the facts. The optics, as they say, are not good. He stared at the flowchart, then at me. He saw his political career dangling by a thread. What do you want? He whispered. Recuse yourself from the vote, David Chun said firmly. Cite a potential conflict of interest. It's the clean way out for you. When the committee convened an hour later, the chairman announced that Assemblyman Miller would be recusing himself from the vote on AB 1128, citing a recently discovered professional conflict. A wave of murmurs went through the room. Julian Croft, sitting in the front row, shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He knew, somehow, that I was behind it. With Miller recused, the balance of power shifted. The vote was held. It passed 4-3. The bill was out of committee. It was a massive victory. The war wasn't over. It still had to pass the full Assembly and the Senate, but we had won the decisive battle. That evening, our coalition gathered on the steps of the Capitol building. We celebrated not with champagne, but with a renewed sense of purpose. We had taken on the most powerful lobby in the state and beaten them, not with money, but with grit, determination, and the undeniable power of the truth. Standing there, watching the sunset paint the Capitol dome in shades of orange and gold, I thought about the long, strange journey that had brought me to this place. It had started in a single, crooked room with a fight for my own survival. It had expanded to a building full of people who needed a champion. And now it had become a fight for the law itself, for the soul of the state. Each victory, each battle had forged me into something stronger, something more. I looked at the determined faces of the people around me, and I knew my work was far from over. The scales of justice were heavy, and it took a lot of hands to hold them steady. And my hands were finally strong enough for the task. The victory in the Housing Committee was a watershed moment, but it was just one battle in a long, grinding war. The Tenant Security Act, AB 1128, now had to navigate the full assembly floor, then cross over to the state senate, and finally survive the governor's veto pen. Julian Croft and the real estate lobby didn't give up. They simply shifted their focus, pouring millions into a media campaign designed to scare suburban and rural voters. Our fight moved from hearing rooms to town halls, from legal briefs to sound bites. The days were a blur of travel, speeches, and tense negotiations. The nights were spent strategizing with the coalition, my condo less a home than a charging station for my exhausted body and mind. We were in the strange legislative limbo, weeks away from the scheduled floor vote, when I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was from a social worker at a city-run long-term care facility. Am I speaking with Clara Thorne, the attorney? The woman asked, her voice weary. You are, I said, pulling up a legal pad, assuming it was a potential new client. My name is Maria. I'm the case manager for a new resident here. His name is Arthur Sterling. The name hit me like a physical blow. Mr. Sterling. I hadn't thought of him in years, not in any concrete way. He was a ghost, a character in my origin story. To hear his name in the present tense was deeply unsettling. I'm sorry, I said, my voice tight. Why are you calling me? Mr. Sterling had a severe stroke about a month ago, Maria explained. He has no family on record. While going through his effects to try and get his affairs in order, I found some old legal correspondence. Your name was on it. It seems you had a settlement with him some years ago. We had a tenant-landlord dispute, yes, I said, the understatement of the century. Well, she sighed, he's in a new dispute now. The city is trying to acquire his property on Elm Street. The building you used to live in. My blood ran cold. Acquire it how? Eminent domain, she said. They've sent him a notice. They want to seize the block for a civic revitalization project. The compensation they're offering is pennies on the dollar. He's going to lose everything he has. He can't advocate for himself. He can barely speak. Honestly, Miss Thorne, I didn't know who else to call. I saw you were a tenants' rights lawyer and I almost laughed. The irony was so thick I could choke on it. The city was trying to take Mr. Sterling's building, and a social worker was calling me, his old adversary, the champion of tenants, to ask for help defending a landlord's property rights. It was absurd. I'm sorry, Maria, I said, my voice hard. Mr. Sterling and I have a complicated history. I'm not the right person for this. My firm represents tenants, not landlords. I can't help you. I gave her the number for the local bar association's referral service and hung up. I tried to put it out of my mind, to focus on the legislative battle ahead. But the call had lodged a splinter in my brain, eminent domain for a civic revitalization project. The phrase sounded slick and bureaucratic. It sounded like a lie. Against my better judgment, I spent a few hours that night doing what I did best. I dug. The revitalization project wasn't a library or a park. It was a proposed high-end retail and condominium complex. And the developer who had partnered with the city, the primary beneficiary of this land seizure, was a subsidiary of a familiar name, Apex Properties, and the law firm representing the developer in their partnership with the city. Croft, Mathis, and Bowen. This wasn't about public good. This was a corporate land grab, sanctioned by the city and executed by my nemesis. They were using the awesome power of the state to seize property from a vulnerable old man, not because they needed it, but because they wanted it. The victim may have been Mr. Sterling, but the crime was the same one I had been fighting my entire career. The powerful were crushing the weak. My principles slammed into my history. Helping Mr. Sterling felt like a betrayal of my own past, of everything I stood for. My colleagues would be horrified. The press would have a field day. But letting Croft and Apex win, letting them abuse the law to enrich themselves, felt even worse. It felt like surrender. The next day I drove to the care facility. It smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. Maria led me to a small room where a shrunken figure sat in a wheelchair, staring out the window. It was Mr. Sterling. He was a ghost of the gruff, angry man I remembered. His face was slack on one side, his eyes clouded with confusion. He looked frail and lost and utterly powerless. He turned his head slowly as I entered, and a flicker of something passed through his eyes. Recognition. He tried to speak, but only a garbled sound came out. His hand, gnarled and shaking, lifted slightly from the arm of the wheelchair. I looked at this broken man, the architect of my hardship, the catalyst for my entire career, and I felt no anger. I felt no satisfaction. All I felt was a profound, weary sense of duty. The law was a shield. And right now, he was the one who needed shielding. My fight wasn't against landlords. It was against bullies. And the bully in this story wasn't Arthur Sterling anymore. I made the most controversial decision of my career. I walked into Sarah's office the next morning and told her I was taking Mr. Sterling's case pro bono. She stared at me as if I had sprouted a second head. Clara, have you lost your mind? We are justice for tenants. We can't represent the very type of man we fight against every single day. The board will never approve it. Our donors will revolt. This isn't about him being a landlord, I argued, my voice passionate. This is about the abuse of eminent domain. It's about Apex and Croft using the city as their private real estate agent. If we let them get away with this, they will use this tactic against apartment buildings full of tenants next. The principle is the same. The law cannot be a tool for the powerful to steal from the weak. It doesn't matter who the weak is. Let me take the case. Not as the firm, as me. I'll do it on my own time. My battle against the city and Apex Properties was swift and brutal. It culminated in a courtroom showdown with Julian Croft. He was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, believing he had me trapped in a public contradiction. He began his cross-examination, his voice dripping with condescension. You have built your entire career, your entire public persona, on fighting for the rights of tenants against, shall we say, unscrupulous landlords. And yet here you are passionately defending the property rights of Mr. Arthur Sterling, a man who records show you yourself once had a significant dispute with. Have you had a change of heart? Or is your commitment to justice merely for sale to whichever side suits your political agenda? I met his gaze from the podium. The entire courtroom was silent. My commitment, Mr. Croft, is not to a side. It is to a principle. And that principle is that the law should not be a cudgel for the rich and powerful to beat down the poor and the weak. My client, Mr. Sterling, is, in this specific case, the weak one. Your client, a multi-billion-dollar corporation, is the powerful one. You are seeking to use the power of the government to take a man's home and his livelihood for your client's private profit. You call that a public benefit. I call it theft. My position has not changed one iota. I am here, as I have always been, to stop bullies from misusing the law. The only thing that has changed is that today, my client happens to be the man who inadvertently taught me my first lesson on the subject. My argument was a sledgehammer. I presented the evidence of collusion, the insulting undervaluation of the property, and the clear private profit motive behind the seizure. The judge, an older woman with a reputation for being fiercely independent, saw the case for what it was. She ruled in our favor, issuing a scathing decision that blocked the eminent domain action and chastised the city for acting as a private concierge for corporate interests. The victory was stunning. It made headlines, but not in the way Croft had hoped. The narrative wasn't one of hypocrisy, but of principle. Tenants champion defends landlord, wins case against corporate developer, one headline read. The win inadvertently boosted the profile of AB 1128, framing our legislative fight as a broader, more principled stand against the abuse of power in all its forms. It gave me a new level of moral authority. A few days later, I visited Mr. Sterling for the last time. I explained to him that the building was safe, that it was still his. He was more lucid this time. He managed a few halting words. "Thank you." He gestured to a small, dusty box on his knitstand. The social worker, Maria, handed it to me. Inside was a collection of his old papers. And tucked in the corner was a familiar white envelope. My envelope. From all those years ago. I opened it. Inside was the check I had written him for 1 month's rent, and the note that went with it. It had never been cashed. He had kept it all this time. Holding that uncashed check, I felt the last lingering ghosts of my past finally dissolve. The anger, the resentment, the bitterness, it was all gone. My relationship with this man had defined my life. He had been my villain, my catalyst, my first victory. And now, in the strangest twist of fate, he had become my client, and the vessel for my most profound professional triumph. I hadn't just beaten my old nemesis. I had, in a way, absolved him. And in doing so, I had finally completely freed myself. The scales were balanced. Now all that was left was to change the world. The victory in the Sterling case was a profound moral and strategic win, but in the ruthless world of state politics, momentum is fleeting. Julian Croft and the real estate lobby didn't care about moral victories. They cared about killing Assembly Bill 1128. My win had made me a more respected public figure, which paradoxically made me a bigger target. They knew they couldn't attack my character again. So they decided to attack my army. The Coalition for Housing Stability was a patchwork of diverse organizations. We had large, well-funded nonprofits, but our heart and soul were the smaller grassroots tenants groups born from neighborhood struggles. They were passionate and dedicated, but they operated on shoestring budgets, constantly on the verge of financial collapse. They were our strength, and Croft, with a predator's instinct, identified them as our weakness. With the full assembly floor vote just 2 weeks away, Croft initiated his endgame. It was a masterstroke of cynical brilliance. He didn't use threats, he used charity, a new philanthropic entity, the Foundation for Urban Harmony, suddenly appeared, offering substantial grants to underfunded housing advocacy groups. One of the key members of our coalition, The East Side Tenants Union, a small but vital group representing thousands of low-income families, was offered a grant of $500,000. For them, it was a miracle. It was enough money to fund their operations for a decade. The offer was delivered by a polished foundation representative. The paperwork was simple. There was just one small condition. To receive the grant, the East Side Tenants Union would have to publicly withdraw its support for the divisive and controversial AB 1128 and instead endorse a more collaborative, moderate alternative. This alternative was a bill the real estate lobby had drafted themselves. It was a Trojan horse, full of loopholes and empty promises, designed to give the appearance of reform while changing nothing. It was a poison pill coated in gold. The head of the East Side Tenants Union, a fiery and passionate organizer named Rosa, called me, her voice torn with anguish. "Clara, I don't know what to do," she confessed. $500,000? Do you know what we could do with that? We could hire 2 more case managers. We could set up a real legal aid fund. We could save hundreds of families. But that they want us to betray everything we fought for. The news sent a shockwave through our coalition. Croft's gambit was diabolical. He was forcing our allies into an impossible choice: secure their own future or hold the line for a bill that might not even pass. He was pitting the good they could do tomorrow against the greater good we were fighting for today. It was an attempt to fracture our coalition from within, to allow the lobby to claim that even tenants groups believed our bill went too far. An emergency meeting of the coalition was called. The mood was tense, frayed. Some members were sympathetic to Rosa's dilemma. Others were furious, seeing it as a test of loyalty. The unity I had worked so hard to build was beginning to crumble. "This is a trap," I argued, standing before the tense faces of the coalition leaders. This foundation appeared out of nowhere. "This money isn't a gift, it's a weapon aimed at the heart of our movement. If we let them buy off one of us, they will pick us apart piece by piece until nothing is left. We stand together, or we fall separately." But I knew a speech wasn't enough. I had to prove it. That night, I dove into the financial records of the Foundation for Urban Harmony. It was a clean, professionally managed foundation on the surface, but that the money trail was intentionally opaque. The initial endowment came from a series of other foundations and trusts. It was a Russian doll of corporate shells, designed to hide the ultimate source. It took me 2 solid days of a deep forensic dive into tax records and corporate filings, but I finally found the link. The primary donor to the largest of the trusts that funded the foundation was a private equity group whose single biggest investor was Apex Properties. I presented my findings to Rosa and the board of the East Side Tenants Union. I laid out the flowchart, just as I had for Assemblyman Miller. The line was clear, connecting the charitable grant directly to the real estate interests trying to kill our bill. "He's not offering you a life raft, Rosa," I said gently.
He's paying you to sink our ship.
Seeing the proof laid out in black and white, Rosa's anguish turned to cold fury. The next day, she held a press conference. With our entire coalition standing behind her, she publicly rejected the grant. She held up my flowchart and showed the assembled media exactly where the money had come from. She called it blood money and accused the real estate lobby of trying to purchase the silence of the very communities they were destroying. The story was explosive. The bribery by charity scandal dominated the news cycle in the final week before the vote. Croft's cynical maneuver had backfired spectacularly, exposing the depths of the opposition's corruption and re-energizing our movement with a new, powerful narrative of integrity against corruption. We had held the line. The day of the vote arrived. The gallery of the State Assembly was packed. I sat with David Chun, Elena Rodriguez, and Rosa. The debate on the floor was fierce, a final dramatic clash of ideologies. Opponents, shamed by the foundation scandal, made their last stand, arguing about property rights and economic freedom. Supporters, armed with our stories and a newfound moral clarity, spoke of human dignity and justice. Finally, the speaker called the question. The electronic voting board lit up. The yeas and nays blinked beside the names of the assembly members. It was excruciatingly close. The fate of our bill, the culmination of more than a year of relentless struggle, came down to a handful of undecided moderates. The final tally blinked onto the screen. Ayes, 41. Nays, 39. A wave of sound washed over the chamber. A stunned silence from the opposition side, and an eruption of cheers, tears, and applause from ours. We had won. We had actually, truly won. I grabbed David's arm and he pulled me into a hug. Elena Rodriguez was openly weeping beside me, her face a beautiful portrait of disbelief and joy. The journey through the Senate and to the governor's desk was still ahead, but the assembly floor had been our Mount Everest. We had scaled it. 6 months later, I stood in the governor's office, watching him use a ceremonial pen to sign AB 1128 into law. The Tenant Security Act was no longer a dream. It was the law of the land. The loopholes had been closed. The protections were enshrined. It wasn't perfect, but it was a profound, systemic change that would protect millions of people for generations to come. David Chun handed me one of the pens he'd used for the signature. It felt impossibly heavy. That evening, I didn't go to the celebration party. I went home to my condo. I walked out onto my balcony and looked out at the sprawling, glittering expanse of the city. From this height, you couldn't see the individual struggles. You couldn't see the eviction notices, the moving trucks, the fear in a family's eyes, but I knew they were there. And I knew that tonight, some of them were sleeping a little easier. I thought back to that crooked room in Mr. Sterling's building, to the terrified young woman I had been, surrounded by textbooks, her future hanging by a thread. She had just wanted to survive. She could never have imagined this. She could never have imagined that her small, desperate fight for her own dignity would ignite a fire that would reforge the law for an entire state. The path had been harder and longer than I could have ever conceived, filled with villains and unexpected allies, with bitter defeats and breathtaking victories. The city lights twinkled back at me, a million small points of life.
I
had fought for them. The law wasn't just a set of rules in a book anymore. It was a living, breathing thing, and I had helped shape it, bend its arc just a little bit closer toward justice. My work wasn't over. For as long as there were people like Croft and companies like Apex, there would always be another fight. But for the first time, looking out at the vast city, I didn't feel the weight of the battles to come. I just felt peace. The scales were balanced. The debt was paid. And I was home.